The US spent years fighting to keep advanced AI chips out of China's hands. It just won that fight. And the result is that American chip companies are now locked out of the Chinese market anyway, not because Washington said no, but because Beijing did. This is Wafer Street. Here's what moved and what it means for your money. Last week, we broke down the ASML-EUV allegation and the bipartisan DUV bill moving through Congress. But here's the part that story didn't cover. Why China isn't even buying chips the US just approved. For years, the assumption on both sides of this debate was simple. The US wants to keep its most advanced AI chips out of Chinese hands, and China wants in. So when the Trump administration approved the sale of Nvidia's H200 chip to Chinese customers, the conventional read was that the floodgates were finally opening. On paper, it looks like the US eased restrictions and China should be buying. In practice, it's something else entirely. China is the one keeping American chips out now. Here's the headline nobody's reading. As of the most recent reporting, not a single H200 chip has been sold to a Chinese company months after approval. US regulators approved the sale. Chinese authorities haven't let domestic AI companies actually buy them. One Brookings analysis put it bluntly. American companies will no longer dominate the Chinese chip market, not because they were banned, but because Beijing decided it didn't want them there. Follow the money, and the story changes. An approval that was supposed to be a win for American companies turned into a locked door from the other side. If this is the kind of breakdown you're looking for, analysis that connects the policy moves to what they actually mean for markets, hit subscribe. New episodes drop every week. This is the question worth sitting with, because it cuts against almost everyone's assumptions about how this rivalry actually works. Part of the answer is strategic independence. If Chinese AI labs build their entire stack on Nvidia hardware, they're permanently exposed to the next US policy swing. And after years of cascading export controls, Chinese policymakers have learned that lesson the hard way. Buying American, even when it's legally allowed, means staying one executive order away from a forced pivot. But here's the deeper part. China doesn't need to settle anymore. China produced over 127 billion integrated circuits in the first quarter alone, up nearly a quarter year over year. Domestic players like Huawei and Cambricon are racing to build AI accelerators that don't depend on Nvidia or its CUDA software ecosystem at all. The capability gap that used to make Nvidia indispensable has been narrowing every quarter. The restrictions have been in place. That's not a coincidence, that's strategy. Years of US export controls pushed China to build a domestic alternative out of necessity. Now that the alternative exists, even when the US says yes, China can afford to say no. This is the choke point that actually decides who wins. Not whether a chip is legally allowed to cross a border, but whether the buyer on the other side actually wants it badly enough to accept the strings attached. Right now, the answer from Beijing is no. There's a second layer that matters just as much for understanding the policy failure. The approval itself came loaded with conditions that make the win even smaller than the headline suggests. Chinese customers can't receive more than half the total volume of H200 chips sold to American customers. Every shipment requires independent third-party testing inside the US before it ships. Chinese buyers have to certify the chips won't be used for military applications. And on top of all that, a 25% tariff applies to advanced computing chips, like the H200, if they're manufactured abroad and routed through the US before export. So even in the scenario where Beijing did say yes, this was never the wide-open door the headlines implied. It was a heavily restricted, heavily taxed, capped allocation, and China still walked away from it. On paper, it looks like a compromise. In practice, it's restrictions piled on top of restrictions, exactly the kind of policy framework that accelerates forced independence rather than preventing it. If this pattern feels familiar, it should. Go back to 2019. The US cut Huawei off from American chip technology, expecting the company to fall behind in 5G networking equipment. Huawei didn't fall behind. It went and built a domestic alternative, and came back a few years later with a flagship smartphone running a 7-nanometer chip made entirely inside China, no American technology required. The lesson from that episode wasn't export controls don't work. It was narrower and more useful than that. Export controls change where capability gets built, but they rarely eliminate the demand for that capability. China didn't stop wanting advanced chips after the Huawei ban. It just built its own supply of them, on its own timeline. What's happening with the H200 right now looks like the same mechanism playing out one step earlier in the sequence. China isn't waiting for a ban this time. It's choosing voluntarily to lean on the domestic alternative it spent years building under pressure, even when the foreign option is sitting right there, legally available. That's a meaningfully different posture than simply being blocked. It suggests the leverage US policy used to have over Chinese chip demand is eroding even in the cases where policy isn't the obstacle anymore. Drop a comment below. Do you think China's domestic chips are actually good enough to replace Nvidia long-term? Or is this just a temporary move while they catch up? That's the real debate, and I want to know what you think. Here's where this turns into a real policy question, and it's worth understanding because it explains why export controls keep failing the same way. Export controls assume one thing, that you can restrict supply and therefore control demand, cut off the chips, and the buyer has no choice but to negotiate. But that only works if there's no alternative. The moment China built a domestic supply chain good enough to use, the US lost its leverage. Not because the policy was wrong, but because the policy worked too well. It created exactly what it was supposed to prevent: forced Chinese independence. This is the pattern worth sitting with. Export controls almost never work the way the people writing them expect. They don't stop the capability, they just move where it gets built. And once it's built domestically, the foreign supplier becomes optional, not essential. That's the choke point that actually decides who wins. Not the machine or the chip, the necessity. Whoever can operate without the other side longest comes out ahead. For policy operators, this is evidence that the chip war's two biggest levers, formal export approval and informal market access, don't move together anymore. You can win the policy fight and still lose the market because your opponent built an alternative while you were fighting. For retail investors, don't read approved for sale to China as China is buying. The actual demand signal is what matters for Nvidia's China-exposed revenue, and right now that signal is close to zero. Watch sales data, not headlines. If Nvidia's China revenue guidance stays flat or drops despite the approval, that's the real market verdict. For tech and AI operators, this is the clearest sign yet that China's AI compute stack is becoming structurally independent of Nvidia, not by ideology, but by capability. If your roadmap assumes a unified global AI hardware market, this quarter is telling you to reconsider that assumption. Plan for a bifurcated world where Chinese companies use Chinese hardware and Western companies use Western hardware, and the two don't talk to each other. If any of this changes how you're thinking about your China exposure, whether that's ASML stock, semiconductor ETFs, or just understanding the geopolitical chessboard, like this video so it reaches more people tracking this stuff. So here's my read. This isn't a story about the US losing the chip war. It's a story about both sides discovering they have less leverage over each other than they assumed a year ago. Washington can approve a sale, it can't force through. Beijing can build a domestic alternative it still hasn't perfected. Neither side gets the clean win the headlines keep promising, and that's going to be the actual shape of this rivalry for longer than either side wants to admit. But here's what matters going forward. The next time the US tries to draw an absolute line in the chip war, whether that's the DUV ban we covered last week or something new, remember this moment. Export controls don't stop capability, they redirect it, and the redirect usually happens faster than policymakers expect. That's the real trade to track. Follow the money, follow the channel. Till next time. And if you want the full context on the ASML allegation and the DUV bill we referenced at the top of this episode, episode 1 is linked in the description. It'll give you the foundation for why this week's story matters so much.